My name is Betsy Cooper. I am the director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, and I am extremely excited that you are all here for our 2019 Demo Day, so thank you for being here. We are an incubator that trains technologists how to do policy. So we take startup founders, academics, engineers, project managers, product managers, lawyers, venture capitalists, and all sorts of awesome people. We give them a paid 10-week fellowship here in the Bay Area. We teach them how to engage in the policy process. It's really intense. You can ask them all about it over a beer later. And then we actually let them build stuff. And today is all about the fellows showing you what they've built. But first, that's me. First, not all of the fellows could be here today, so I wanted to just very briefly tell you a bit about the projects that we've already launched. So first, one of our fellows, Aloni Cohen, focused on the California Consumer Privacy Act, and he actually created mock regulations for how the Consumer Privacy Act could actually deal with probabilistic identifiers. He believes that probabilistic identifiers, things that will tell you with a certain amount of probability whether or not you are being targeted or not, should be more clearly included in the CCPA, and he actually submitted regulations to the California Attorney General to try to fix that. We also had a number of fellows create the Tech Buzzwords Dictionary. So this was by Erica Green and Alex Rosenblatt. And this dictionary, it's actually live right now, so feel free to go play with it if you want. It's a dictionary that basically takes tech buzzwords and provides useful definitions sort of in the model of an urban dictionary. So we can click on, and I forget what we're going to click on in this video, but the Great Pivot to Privacy, and you can see definitions, you can see all sorts of different themes for how to engage with it, and then you can click through and see other definitions that might be related to it. So if you need tech buzzwords or how to define them, go to the Tech Buzzwords Dictionary. Next was Liz Ruiz, and she created the Hopper Tech Media Lab. She's focused on how tech policy is a women's issue. And so it's a tech policy and career website that creates a lot of sort of guides, both for mid-career level women working in tech and for the companies that employ them. So check that out as well. And then Dr. Amina Asim focused on the programmatic ad supply chain, thinking about how we can help journalism create transparency. And so she created a problem toolkit around programmatic advertising, and then a really cool auditing proposal that could be implemented to help journalists survive in the age of programmatic advertising. We also have two projects launching today that weren't able to join us. So first, Stephen Buccini focused on risk-limiting audits. Stephen actually ran for office in his home state of North Carolina and believes that we need much more election security. And so he created an explorable explanation for understanding a new type of auditing called risk-limiting audits. And you can go online and play with it and actually pull the sliders around and understand why it's a better type of auditing system for elections. And then he created a policy brief for his home state of North Carolina, trying to advocate for that. He hasn't succeeded yet, but he did get his hometown to actually adopt paper ballots, so he's already made some progress. And then finally, Sean Ahrens created a new platform called DemDoc. And DemDoc is a new way to create actual democratically built sorts of documents, including regulations, but could be for co-ops, could be for small city councils. So just imagine you're trying to write a document in which you have lots of ideas and you want the most democratic, so the thing that is voted on most successfully, to be chosen. Well, you can use DemDoc to add modified wording to the document, and then you can have people vote up and down for the different wordings, and the ones that get the most votes automatically become the new document. So it's basically like a Google Docs, except where you get to pick the most democratically oriented outcome, and it appears automatically. So he's already been piloting this with a local co-op here. So that's what we've already got. And so I hope this gives you a sense of the kind of creativity and the opportunities that we want to bring here. But we also want to inspire all of you, wherever you come from, to get engaged in the tech policy process. And it's for that reason that we've brought Nicole Wong, who happens to be one of my favorite people. She was also the former U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States and is a senior advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group. So I hope she'll help us kick off the experience here by inspiring you a little bit as to why you should care about tech policy. So Nicole, over to you. We have to double mic. So.
Oh, okay. My kid and I were laughing about this photo because that photo was taken when she was 1 year old, and she's now 16. So I should get a new headshot taken. Good evening to all of you. It is such a pleasure to be here at SF Demo Day. Betsy and I have been talking, I think for years now, about the urgent importance of developing professionals who are bilingual in both technology and public policy. Professionals who can help us as a society understand what tech can and can't do to advance public policy goals. So Betsy, I'm so honored to be here to see your vision realized in the ambitious project of the Tech Policy Hub, and I'm humbled by the incredible talent of the first cohort of the Hub's fellows. The projects that are showcased here tonight are inspiring, as is the commitment demonstrated by each of your careers in putting technology into the service of people. So Betsy asked me to speak for about 15 minutes, and then maybe we'll have a little time for questions. As usually happens when I walk into a room like this, a room filled with smart technologists, I suffer from a little bit of imposter syndrome. My name is Nicole, and I'm a liberal arts major. In fact, I'm an American Studies major and English minor, and my fellowship was in poetry. My graduate degrees are not from the computer science or electrical engineering departments at Cal. They're from the School of Journalism and Law. But I also have over 20 years of experience working in the tech sector, and I proudly served as President Obama's Deputy Chief Technology Officer with responsibility for privacy, internet, and innovation policy. So maybe I stand as a proof point that tech is in fact a big tent, and even with all of those liberal arts cards stacked against me, I found a job and a place in the tech world. Relevant for this crowd, I'm hopefully the archetype of your future colleague, a policy wonk who shares your vision about how technology can help make people's lives better. The one who asks you to stay late to explain the output of that algorithm, where exactly the data is stored and when delete really means delete, and really, one more time, how differential privacy works. I'm the one who wants to be your partner in this complicated dance between technology and policy to do the job of serving the public interest. I believe tech can change how we behave as humans, and that humans influence how we build tech, and policy expresses the vision of how that relationship should work. The Hub, this fellowship, gets us a step closer to that future where the dance is real, where technology is not just bolted on at the end of a policy process, but is integral to the development, and it plays a continuing role as policy unfolds over time. It is the future of technology policymaking that takes seriously not only the question of what do we build, but who do we build for? But here's where we really are. There's not enough of you. People with tech skills who want to put their talent into public service. We have a pipeline problem. The need for modern technology in government is clear. Last year, our federal government spent $96 billion on IT. According to the federal agency CIOs, about 60% of those projects are at risk of being either over budget or behind schedule. The Social Security Administration, which pays $1 trillion in Social Security and disability benefits to 70 million Americans, relies on 60 million lines of COBOL, a computer language that was created in 1959. That's not merely inefficient, unable to take full advantage of open source databases and the scaling capabilities of cloud computing. There are actually a diminishing number of programmers in the workforce who know how to maintain this code. And that failure of our infrastructure and the modernization of our tech workforce puts the benefits of 70 million Americans at risk. This is not moonshot technology, but here's why it matters. The foundations of our democracy are built on the promise that government will deliver for the people. We are at the lowest point of public trust in government since the 1970s, and that's not about what's happening in DC this week. Those are statistics from a Pew Research study stretching from 1958 to 2015, before Donald Trump was elected. In 1964, 64% of Americans believe that government is run for the benefit of all people. In 2015, that number had dropped to 19%. 19. So let's pause this week's conversation about Russians and foreign interference and political polarization and consider that the erosion of trust in our government has been on a long slide. And one of the reasons is that we are not delivering for the people it's supposed to serve. That's why the non-glamorous work of modernizing a 70-year-old system matters just as much or more as perfecting a self-driving car or putting a person on Mars. We need DevOps and site reliability engineers and people who understand modern stack software development. We need people with the full suite of skills to build technology from human-centered design to product management. We need people with deep expertise in data governance, information security, and privacy. And those people need to understand how these skills advance our policy goals. Yes, to upgrade systems, but also to harness technology to serve all people, and particularly those most in need. If we can order a gluten-free chocolate cake on our mobile phone while sitting in our living room and have it delivered in an hour, then we should be able to help a single mother get food stamps without having to take a day off of work and fill out paperwork and stand in line at a limited hours government office. We should be able to get our benefits to our veterans who have fought for our country and the world that makes this tech possible in less than the 137 days, which was the average time it took their benefits to be processed up until the launch of a new system just earlier this year. We should be able to help immigrants renew their green cards in less than 6 months, a project that had been underway for 6 years at a cost of $1.2 billion with no results until we sent in a 6-person team in 2016 that rebuilt the entire process online in less than 18 months. Whether you leave here to work in city, state, or federal government, or a nonprofit, or in any capacity of public service, we can and must do better. Our failure to serve the people who most need the help, that is the source of the growing divide in our country and the challenge of our times. That is the most important technology problem before us. The good news is that the trend line in digital service delivery in the public sector looks strong, although it's hard to find real numbers. In the last decade, we've gone from 0 state-level chief data officers to 25 plus DC. So many that the Beek Center at Georgetown just this week launched a state CDO network. In a survey last year of small, medium, and large cities, 49% of the mayors reported that they had dedicated staff for managing data, and 34% had staff for innovation. There are 85 Code for America volunteer brigades around the country that collaborate with local governments and community organizations to build tech tools. And anecdotally, among those tens of thousands of volunteers, about 20 to 30% are actively seeking public sector tech jobs. Okay, so let's say we solve the pipeline problem with programs like the Hub and this fellowship. And now I'm going to speak to the rest of the room and not just the fellows. We must not squander their talent. We must stop consigning the technical talent in government to the back office. They are not here to solve our email problems. What do we need to do? So here's a few modest proposals. We need to take recruitment seriously, and not just tech folks, but diverse tech folks. That means actively going to find the best talent, and particularly among women and people of color, and convince them of their place in public service. The rest of the tech industry is beating down their doors with free food and massages at work, and we'll never be able to match that. But we can offer them the opportunity to make a difference at scale on the critical issues they care about. And we can create the type of flexibility that allows those folks to do tours of duty for 6 months or a year, which not only helps attract amazing talent, but actually encourages the refresh of tech knowledge in our government. We also need to send up a signal that government is safe for nerds. We need to create the environment that ensures they have modern tools to work with and the ability to do the type of experimentation, iterative design, and sometimes failure that is commonplace in tech, but still viewed warily by government. We need to actively create a space in which their talent is not only welcomed, but resourced. Third, we desperately need to change how we do procurement. Today, most public sector procurement processes are designed for waterfall development instead of agile, and it assumes that the government at the start of a project has full knowledge of what's needed and can specify in excruciating detail. It assumes that there will be no new ideas, knowledge, or conditions that will change during the project, and that is particularly difficult when it comes to software development. Finally, and most importantly, tech talent needs to be at the decision-making table, not just for clearly technical issues like revamping our Medicare databases or moving food stamp benefits online, although of course we need your help for that, but we also need you for decisions not only about the viability and safety of flying drones in commercial airspace, but about the privacy and civil liberties implications of doing so. We need you to help address natural disasters like fires or hurricanes by employing new communications, transportation, and sensor technologies. We are in the midst of a moment and a movement of tech-savvy people coming into public service. But to sustain this movement, we need to institutionalize our place at the table. We're seeing this happen in small corners of government, like the Boston Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics or the US Digital Services in 18F, which provide tech and other types of expertise for new approaches to building government services. Or we can see it in the nascent local governance bodies, like Oakland's Privacy Advisory Commission, which reviews surveillance technologies before they're adopted by the city, or New York City's Automated Decision System Task Force, which was created to oversee the use of algorithmic decision-making in city agencies. These are good starts, but we need to see more. Because here's the thing, a movement can slip back into being just a moment if we fail to institutionalize its power. We as a society and certainly as policymakers, need to ensure your seat at the table, value your input, and engage you as the critical contributors that you are. Okay, so let's assume we assemble an army of you and we create a space for you at all levels of government. Let's even say we put resources behind you. Which problems are we going to solve? Now we get to the existential question, what do we build and who do we build for? And I'm conscious of the fact that this is the month and year in which Ridley Scott's techno-dystopic film Blade Runner takes place, so I may sound like I'm channeling Roy Batty. From a tech perspective, I have never seen the industry more in crisis in the 20+ years of doing this work. They are embattled by governments here and abroad, trolled by malicious and malign actors, and deeply uncertain about their own role in this world. And from time to time, I revisit John Perry Barlow's adamant Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace from 1996, in which he wrote to all the governments of the world, quote, "I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement that we have true reason to fear." I remember reading those words and thinking he had gotten caught up in a weird techno-fever dream, but it does capture what we now recognize as naive optimism of the time, that the cyberspace community would stand for purer values than the physical world, that it could self-govern, that earthly governments could only corrupt its democratic essence. This, of course, was all wrong. As technologists, whether you end up building tech for the public or the private sector, it is your responsibility to give proper recognition to the people who will live, willingly or not, with your technology. Those people live in a context of laws and governments, social norms and biases, economic, physical, and personal challenges that defy being captured in code. So, a few final words of advice. Build ambitiously and inclusively to cover the full spectrum of people and their needs. Build systems that are responsive and accountable. Be awesome at tech, but also be honest about the things that tech can't solve and the things that it can make worse. With that said, If you go on to work in the area of tech policy, your most important milestones in the next few years will not be any particular project or system that you build. The work of the next few years is actually to change the culture in the public sector about tech's role and the processes and decision frameworks that support it. Our challenges in this century are huge. The security of our infrastructure, from telecommunications to electricity to transportation, the integrity of the census that will start next year, the introduction of more and new surveillance technologies in our cities, and the use of that data in our name. At the end of the day, as my friend Jen Palka says, this government is still just us. No one guarantees us a functional democracy. As technologists, it is our responsibility to care for our future, to insist on being part of its development, and to take seriously technology's roles in our lives, our communities, and our governments. Congratulations, fellows, and thank you for your service. Okay.
So we have time for a few questions. Okay, of course.
One right.
Ron, would you grab me?
Thank you so much for your fantastic comments. It's super inspiring. My name is Daniel Wu. I work at a data ethics startup. Essentially, my question to you is, what are some examples of culture change for trust? Any stories that you can share about that happening? You mentioned the critical role of trust, especially for the policy work that this involves. I want to point everyone to OECD's Trust Lab report, where they looked cross-nationally at different surveys to think about the predictors of trust. One of the biggest predictors was the perception that you believe that the political process, the policy process, is corrupt and is not just stacked in favor of those who have more money and influence. And I think that while we should also be thinking about policies that are optimal, how do we also think about the policy process to be equitable, fair, and trustworthy? So I'd love to hear a story, anecdote, or an example that you can share about trust being built successfully.
Yeah, let me take that in two ways, because like trust in culture, or changing culture trust, and then trust in our systems trust are two slightly different things. So like trust in our systems, absolutely. And I think there's a really interesting movement now around how do we become more transparent about the systems and how they work, particularly in the area of like, I hate using the word AI, but like algorithmic decision making, right? So that's the start of what is happening in New York, which is like, how do we define the system that is making automated decisions, and how do we open that black box of decision making to sort of interrogate whether those decisions are being made fairly, right? And that we agree with them or can contest them. So I think that's one part of how do we build for trust. Part of it is that level of transparency. In the culture part of it, my experience, and I was in the Obama administration when we stood up the US digital services, doing that in a large government entity takes a lot of trust. You can't come in and say like, I'm here to change the world, move fast and break things. That's not a thing we do in government. And in particular, when some of the things you break may be someone's benefits, that's actually an unacceptable level of work. And so coming in a humble way to a group of people who could make a lot more money elsewhere, and instead they're doing public service work and being respectful of that and making that work to the benefit of all of the people, that's the kind of attitude you have to go in with. And I've seen it done poorly and some do it well. But to me, as some of you go into service, it's really important to keep in mind the environment that you're coming into and to treat it with respect.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Michael Golding with the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'd like to ask about policymaker priorities when it comes to technological regulation. In particular, I guess the conception is that policymakers are essentially answerable to their constituents, and most people, as according to my understanding, don't care too much about technology regulation. I mean, if you ask about major concerns, it's the economy, it's healthcare, those list goes on and on. You have to get pretty far down there before you see things like breaking up big tech companies and whatnot. So I'm just kind of curious, what's the disconnect? And is this something that that grassroots voters and people who are actually putting policymakers off should care about more, and why aren't they caring more about it?
So I guess I would push a little on the premise of healthcare isn't a thing that matters and that technology isn't a big part of that. So healthcare.gov, right? It was really important that people be able to get healthcare, and the fact that our website broke down on the first day of launch, that was a bad technology happening, and our priority was misplaced perhaps in making sure that we got the tech part right of the policy goal of getting everyone healthcare. But so I guess part of the question is why aren't some of the big tech issues, data privacy, content regulation, and other things, a bigger issue for folks? Part of it is I think it may be somewhat abstracted from some people's daily lives. Even though your data is collected all the time, every minute out of your phone and other devices, you may not be seeing how that changes your world and environment. Some of that is actually about education for a wider mass of people, although I'd say in the last decade we've gotten much more sophisticated in our understanding of how our data gets used and reused. That said, I wouldn't put everything on the public to know and to care how their data gets used. And so then that's actually the role of experts and civil society, right? People like EFF or the ACLU, who have been super active in this space for 20 years or more. And to empower them, right, to be on the lookout. There's a dance, this is part of the dance, which is there are lots of players in the space. Some of them are regulators, some of them are civil society, some of them are the users themselves, and some of them are the tech companies holding themselves accountable in some sense. And figuring out the dance and the responsibilities among those four players is actually the test we have for the next generation.
Fantastic. We're going to have to leave it there, but first I want to thank you with a little parting gift from the Hub. It contains actual branded Aspen Tech Policy Hub chocolates, so if you didn't already want to apply, we now have that. And sorry, fellas, we didn't have those for you guys yet, but we're working on it. So I want to give a brief intro to the ground rules for the fellows' presentation. So each fellow has a very strict limit of 7 minutes in which they will presenting. So this is a true pitch demo for you all. And then we will ask the audience to give them 1 or 2 questions after their presentation. So don't go easy on them. Please give them some tough questions, and please try to help us out by thinking some of those. And so I'm going to introduce our first fellow. This is Steve Weiss, and he is going to go first as soon as he is set up. He is a startup founder. He's a fantastic engineer. He worked at Facebook for a long time, and now he's going to talk to you about classified threat sensors for national security. So over to you, Steve. You get both. No, you need both, actually. Yep.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Betsy and Nicole. I'm glad you all made it here tonight. My name is Steve Weiss, and tonight I'm going to be talking about detecting nation-state cyber attacks with classified threat sensors. This was joint work with myself and Dr. Aloni Cohen and Dr. Amina Asim. And high level, the problem we were looking at is that private companies are under attack by foreign nation states. So you think about Google with China, Sony with North Korea. These are just private industry companies that have to actually defend themselves against the entire nation, against China, against other countries. So we looked at what we could do to actually help tip the balance to private companies' favor. And through the process, we talked to a lot of different CISO and technical people and government and private industry. And one kind of common theme that came up was threat sharing. So a lot of the feedback we got was that companies would like to get better access to intelligence from government. And one challenge is that some of the best threat intelligence is classified. And companies can't access that because intelligence community can't really give a company like Google classified intelligence without leaking its methods and means of actually collecting it. So this is the problem that we ran against and we're thinking about solving. The challenge here is, imagine you had a private company network and they have security logs, and as a cyber attack happens, it leaves things called indicators of compromise. This might be like IP addresses or URLs or file hashes, and these would appear in their logs. Now, their threat detection can't detect it unless they know what they're looking for. And while there's private companies that have threat intelligence feeds, there may be things that are known on the government and intelligence community side that private companies do not yet. So the question is, can private industry apply classified intelligence without leaking it? And to achieve this, we have something we call a classified threat sensor. And essentially, it's software that can be run by a private company that can take encrypted intelligence and use it to search over your own security logs. And we're calling this CANARY, which is a backronym for Classified Analysis of Network Attacks in a Restricted Execution Environment. And I have to thank Alani Cohen for coming up with that, because it's great. The technology we're making use of is something called a secure enclave. And you could think of this as a small, safe space to run your software inside a processor, inside a CPU itself. And this lets you run your own software on somebody else's computer with the guarantee that it'll run the correct software, and that computer's operating system can't actually see inside the enclave. So it's a very nice building block. And one example is Intel's Secure Software Guard Extensions technology, or SGX. So that's going to be our building block for this. And how it's going to work is that we have our classified environment and unclassified environment with the respective data. And you'll have your own private computing resources that are enabled with Secure Enclave. So you're using Intel CPUs. Part of this will be based on a open source project. And this will have two components. One is a verification service, and the other is the actual CANARY, which is the bird icon in the enclave itself. And that's a small program. So once that's started, the way that you'll actually search for threat data is that the verification service will first make sure that you're running the right software. And that's very important because this classified intelligence agency can't give you the encrypted data unless they know it's running the right software. Once it's verified, they can take their intelligence and encrypt it and then send that straight into the enclave, which is inside a CPU on a private company's computer. And this data is not visible on the network. It's not visible to that computer or that organization. It just goes straight into this little safe space. And once it's in there, you can start searching over that local private data, those local security logs, and then return either a hit or a miss. And this is also important because we don't want this to be PRISM, where the intelligence agency is sucking data out of the private company. It just tells whether something is seen or not seen. Now, what you do with that is, if the CANARY dies in the coal mine and it sends that something happened back to the intelligence agency, they'll just escalate to a person. So they don't know what it is, they don't know what was seen, but some person's going to have to get involved and be notified that this company had something seen, you need to contact them, and then from there, you would escalate through some legal or law enforcement process, kind of the regular channels you would today if you found out that there was something going on. So the intelligence agency would learn, as these are deployed, whether there's trends across many companies, and the company would be able to get notified if they're under attack that they wouldn't otherwise know of. So the high level is that CANARY lets you apply encrypted intelligence inside a secure enclave, and this can be used in multiple scenarios, so government, industry, and for that we've kind of outlined a 5-phase plan. First would be an open source project, and then there'd be various different trial deployments. So an industry one, government, and then finally government to industry sharing for unclassified, and then finally classified information. And the nice part about this is no matter how far you got into these phases, each one has some value. So even if it was just an open source project or that you just had an industry trial, that's something companies could use to share data with each other. So it's a nice building block that you can use in lots of different contexts. So to achieve that first step, we're proposing that $150,000 in funding be provided for a couple student developers and researchers, along with a professor or principal investigator, to deliver a proof of concept that kind of has the whole end-to-end system of the verification server, the enclave, and then also ingressing the threat data in the standard format. And this would be something you could build out in 6 months over a semester with a couple students. So I'd like to wrap it up there and thank some of our supporters, so Craig Newmark Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, Almadyar Networks, and Mozilla. And if you'd like some more information, on the bottom there, that's the domain, canary.info. That has a video, some slides, and some paper write-ups about this. And I will wrap it up there and take questions.
We'll hold your applause until the questions are over and save your questions, please. Thanks. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know how, is it okay if it's a very specific and like tactical question? Great. So the 150K, is there a reason that you're, one, is it already funded through those foundations that you had on the last page? And if it's not, is there a reason to do it as a grant instead of equity? Because there's just a lot more equity capital, or there's a lot of equity capital searching for stuff that looks compelling like this. So it's like, it would be easier to, or, yeah.
I mean, you could use this as a technology for a startup and try to sell some threat intelligence software. I like the idea of doing it under a student grant because the output would be open sourced, and then you could have it adopted for different scenarios and also used for other applications. So this idea of doing kind of searching over private data, it's not just for threat intelligence, but could be used in lots of contexts. But yeah, there's nothing precluding it from being a private company going out and building this on their own.
Hi, could you please go back to the slide where you talk about the classified service?
This one, or?
The one before it, I think. Yeah. So there's a verification service that's in the classified box.
Yes.
Do you expect the verification service, and I imagine the verification service is deployed in the secure enclave, do you imagine that to be like a continuous link? So that's my first question. My second question is, don't you think there is something like some kind of philosophical, like makes you feel bad idea that there's a container in your own computer that is basically a black box? You don't know what's in there. That could be a security threat, could be a risk. Bad actors could have access to it. There could be a virus running, could be selling your data. That's my question.
Yeah, so the verification service is just at startup. So that would be used to identify the enclave and then basically get key material out of it. The second question is basically already exists in your computer. So there's already microcode and then environments that are running that you don't have any visibility into. And I am blanking on the name of it. I want to say SMC, but I'm wrong. But this exists already. So there's opaque code running on an Intel processor now that you can't see. And this one is actually auditable because it's an open source project. And so if you run this, you see the source code and you could measure that it's actually running, because that's actually a very important part of it, because you as a company need to make sure that this thing is not sending back search records over your data. You have to actually audit it and believe that it's just sending one bit. I think Eric had a question?
Right. Eric Rose, former paranoid CISO type person who was dealing with this kind of system that wasn't classified. It was just a commercial system, but I still didn't trust them. And so the only way I would allow that in my network was to not have step 5. I didn't want any network traffic going back. I could accept that if I was able to see what was inside. It's okay if it's encrypted on the network, but I have to be able to see the traffic that's inside 5 so that I can verify search traffic's not being released. Is that still feasible within your model?
So this brings up a good point. This is almost two untrusted parties. So we don't want the classified agency to mine data from the company. We also don't want the company to mine data from this enclave. And so the reason that this has to be encrypted and sent back to an intelligence agency is that this company could send adversarial stuff to this enclave, and if they see the results, they can use it as an oracle. There might be some settings where you could do this. We'd have things that were rate limited or other ways of having this detected, but on this design would actually limit that. But there could be models where you relax that and you have some trust that the private company is going to be honest but not malicious and not try to query this thing.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you very much.
So next we're going to move on to our largest team. So I'm going to watch while they get mic'd. But so first let me get to the right slide. Awesome. So I now want to turn it over to our AKA team. So this is Allison Day, Carissa McKelvey, and Anil Devan. And they will be talking to you about modern data systems for responsible pretrial risk assessment. And so just to explain the two mics, one is for the video and one is for the audio here. So that's why we're doing it that way. So thank you again.
Thanks, Betsy.
Oh, clicker. That's what I'm missing. I'm like, psh. Thanks everyone for coming. Which button is this? We're technologists here. I turned it off. Okay. Okay, so I'm Allison. I'm here with Anil and Carissa, my two teammates. We're here to talk about California pretrial data pipeline reform, and what that is basically how our background in software development can be used to fight mass incarceration. So we're in particular looking at the pretrial space. So what is pretrial incarceration? This is after people are arrested, they go to jail and they wait until their trial and until they're convicted. So we're addressing specifically populations of people that are held before ever being convicted of a crime, waiting weeks or months until their trial. So how big is this problem? Of the 2.3 million people that are incarcerated in the United States currently, we're looking at the orange piece of the pie, which is a substantial population of people held in jail. Looking a little bit closer, this percentage here, 462,000 people are being held in jail without having been convicted of a crime. So this is the pretrial space that we're looking to reform. So our belief is that data-driven insights can speed pretrial release. Our goal is to release more low-risk individuals being held pretrial. So what is low risk? Who is low risk? These are folks who have a low likelihood of reoffending if they're released back into the community while they await their trial, and they have a high likelihood to actually show up back in court. So how do we know people are low risk? This is where the data comes in. So database risk assessment and pretrial release outcomes analysis are what we can use to fuel faster pretrial release outcomes and make sure that we're making the right decision to release the right people back into the community. The current approach that California is using to do this, the state is funding individual counties to improve practices. But our plan is to modernize the pretrial data system to scale, and that means we're looking at the state level to implement ways to accurately, quickly, and transparently and justly release people pretrial. So our approach to do this was to perform case studies. We talked to a couple different California counties, and we were trying to figure out a solution to do this with a limited budget. So we interviewed a lot of people, both at the policy level, state officials, AI policy experts. We analyzed currently used software development practices at 4 commercial and nonprofit organizations that are currently working in the pretrial space, and we read a lot of different papers. In addition, we are all professionals working in the software development area. So the challenges that we found were that each county, in order to accurately predict who is low risk and who isn't, they need to be able to pull data from multiple criminal justice databases. They need to then, in order to analyze and report on outcomes, clean and aggregate that data, analyze data, create standard metrics, publish reports, and then send that standardized data for state level analysis. Now, people working in pretrial are working for the probation department in most counties. People getting hired at probation departments are not necessarily data experts. These are folks that are trained to work with incarcerated people, do case management. They're law enforcement officials. They're not necessarily technologists. So California has 58 different counties. Each county has a separate system to implement all of these data needs. A lot of that data is missing. Counties lack the time and technical resources to do this. Just a few data points. 60% of arrest records are missing disposition information in California. This information is vital to performing these risk assessments to determine who's low risk and who's high risk. 80% of counties have 9 or fewer employees that are actually even dedicated to pretrial release, and most of those people are not, they're working on the ground, they're not working in data analysis. And then there's poor Del Norte, not Del Norte, but Del Norte County at the very north of California. This is a one-stop shop. There was one person working at their pretrial. This is a county of 27,000. We went back to paper, she said. The software management systems that were being used by probation were too complex, too slow to respond to their needs. They just went back to total manual processes. So this, in essence, is a mess. But we want to solve these problems. And what's at stake, again, is the liberty of individuals being held without having been convicted of a crime and the reduction of the jail population. So with that, I'll send it over to Anil. Oh.
Cool. Hi, everybody. So my name is Anil, so I'll talk about some of the recommendations and then we'll pass it on to Carissa. So basically, based upon our research, we came up with 4 recommendations, right? And what we realized was that the need is so great at the county level, at the state level, and they are so far behind that really what they need to do is they need to learn how to crawl before they could even walk at this stage. So the first recommendation we have is that instead of going for typical government contracts, which are these large procurement efforts that run multiple years, cost millions of dollars, the county and the state really need to focus on building modular tools that are capable of living on top of existing systems. So what we really mean is that this is what typically happens, right? Let's rip out the whole system, let's spend millions of dollars over 3 to 5 years that never sees the light of day, to doing something like this, where you actually build modular systems that can live on existing systems, and then it gives you more flexibility as your needs grow to adapt the system. So for example, what are we really talking about here is that one, the Judicial Council should really look at the state of California's technology needs in the pretrial space as a whole, and not county by county, which is how they're currently approaching it. So the idea there is that they can group common systems together, and based upon that actually develop common solutions that could be shared across multiple counties. These modular tools sit on top of legacy systems instead of ripping out the legacy systems, which allows us to get started a lot quicker. It's a lot cheaper to implement, and it also allows for quicker updates and flexibility as the needs grow and change. And then lastly, as Allison mentioned, data is a really key part of this. This is why this is so important. And so to really have dashboards that are standardized across the state, standardized across the counties, to really help them be able to track the outcomes that they're trying to get. So the second recommendation is to partner with modern software development companies. So again, government, typically I work for USDS, so we spend millions and billions of dollars on software, as Nicole also mentioned, that never see the light of day. And a lot of times the tendency is to go with large established enterprise companies, partially because they know the procurement processes, we know who the players are, they have a lock on the system, and the smaller players who actually have more innovation and better technologies get overlooked. So traditional enterprise software companies are large and slow. It takes them forever to deliver software. Usually it's out of date by the time it actually comes into the market, versus something like this, right? Like smaller companies that are small, nimble, agile, and actually have really powerful technologies to offer. These companies specialize in agile development, user-centered design. Their budgets run in the hundreds of thousands of dollars as opposed to the millions or billions of dollars. Some companies that we talked to during our research, California Policy Lab, so this is a nonprofit organization that is actually working with the city of San Francisco, and they have developed a dashboard that is used by the city of San Francisco to track pretrial outcomes. Right, so this is a company that is already doing this work. It's a small organization. And why are their dashboards not available across the state in different counties? Because nobody's really approached the problem that way. Here's another example of a company called Open Lattice. So they specialize in open source software. They're doing work in the criminal justice space in the state of California. There is also Recidiviz, which has currently criminal justice software, open source software running in 5 states in the United States, not in California. And their data solutions are actually powering needs for states for 10% of the incarcerated population in the United States. So these are companies that are trying to do the right thing. They specialize in open source software, but they just don't really know how to actually get into the procurement side of things. The Santa Clara County is an outlier. They've actually done their own work, which is kind of amazing. They built their own tool that is pretty, that should be open sourced and shared across the county. And then our third recommendation is to hire software engineers. Again, to Nicole's point, decision makers tend to be administrators who don't understand technology a lot of times. And what we're saying is that you need to have technologists be at the table. They also need to be in the offices where they're actually building solutions, and you're not just outsourcing your tech talent to others. And yeah, so basically hire tech talent internally, find self-starters who are able to work with legacy systems and come up with creative solutions and actually build them in-house, and focus on the public service mission. In our paper, we've offered 3 job descriptions to sort of help clarify what we mean by the kind of people that they should hire. Thank you.
I'm an expert in open source software, so I was offering in the paper a lot of recommendations. A lot of the people that we talked to, when we asked them about open source, they had no idea what we were talking about, or they were just like, I don't want to use open source, it's insecure, or something like this. So I think there's a lot of room to grow for folks thinking about open source software in production and how that can really increase and improve outcomes over time for government. So one of the things we recommend is defaulting to open. And this prevents legacy lock-in that kind of created this problem in the first place. So when we look at proprietary software and procurement processes, you then have an incentive being built by the companies to not allow you to modify and change your own software over time. So then you have to continue to stay with that company forever because they're the only ones that have ownership over that code. And so government needs to be able to own its own code and also share that code with the communities. And when the developer communities engage with the code, it will actually increase and have greater code integrity over time. And this has been proven over the past 10 years. And government at the federal level is already starting to move towards this. And so at the state level, we need to do that as well. And data security can be ensured through encryption, and only the code should be shared, not the data. So we can share metrics or the code and the dashboard code between counties, so counties can still have their own data stored locally. We're really just talking about the code here. So we kind of clarify those points in the paper as well. So we build modular tools, partner with modern companies, hire software engineers, and use open source software. So why now? Why are we talking about this? So the California Judicial Council was awarded $75 million in grants by the state, and they're giving these grants to 16 counties across California. They just announced this year. This will be an ongoing project for the next couple of years. 10% of that money is used for technology assistance, and it's being held by the Judicial Council exactly for this. So that's $7.5 million that the Judicial Council could use today to start this plan. And so we're going to be presenting our recommendations to the Judicial Council and connecting counties and the technologists at the Judicial Council to these modern software development shops. And we're hoping that they will use the job descriptions and hire the right people with this money. So that's all. Thank you very much.
I love this project, by the way. So I have a question about the data, because my assumption is that county to county, to the extent they're tracking data, they're probably doing it with different classifications and different taxonomy for the data. That strikes me as a huge hurdle, because this population is going to move from county to county, right? Like the people who actually we need data about will be in different places when they get arrested. What's your view on, is that a state level necessary fix, or is there some other way to get to that problem?
Yes. Yeah. So, there's actually other states. So we were talking about recidivism. Anil was talking about recidivism. They've already done this in other states, and California is actually a laggard in this. So, California has a lot of opportunity to grow in terms of standardizing this stuff at the state level. But the Judicial Council has already created a lot of standards for this.
And also just to add, so the Judicial Council released a really elaborate data schema on all the data that they want the counties to have collected, but they didn't require them to do so, right? They're like, this is what we're aiming for. So we worked with recidivists to say, here is what the Judicial Council wants. What can your tool currently do, or what could it be expanded to accommodate? And they actually found that a lot of the data that they're collecting in the criminal justice space is already covered. So the incremental cost of actually making this increase and change is not that much, and then you can customize it to the individual counties once you have sort of the large schema created.
Thank you for the presentation. I think it's really excellent that we're focusing on these, prerequisites to having a data-informed society. But I also want to ask about the data, because it seems like to me that when you're building a process that is making the data pipeline more thorough and stuff, you could also just be enabling and justifying discriminatory practices in the past by saying this is what was in the data before, and look, the data is here, this is what it supports. And particularly with recidivism that you have and pretrial assessment, you have a big problem where you don't actually observe outcomes for people who you do choose to keep in detention, right? So that's something that like you can collect, you can standardize all the data and put it in a computer. We also need to change practices in order to, figure out like who are we actually falsely putting in detention.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a, this approach is, we came to this problem looking at algorithmic risk assessment, and obviously there's an enormous amount of backlash against the bias that's inherent in the data sets that are being used to feed these risk assessment decisions. Our goal was sort of to do harm reduction on this. So many counties and so many jurisdictions across the country and California are already using these risk assessment tools. We wanted to create at least better data visibility so that these tools, the tool use can be governed, and so we can actually look at outcomes, track outcomes, look at what the metrics are, fill in missing like holes in the data that's needed to inform these. And so I think by creating the tools and the modern kind of data analysis and visualization capacities, that can allow us to even do what you're suggesting, which is to take a look and make changes and do assessments for bias and assessments for these negative things. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm sorry we're going to have to do just one or two, but that's why we have a happy hour afterwards. You can ask them all your questions. So thank you so much, team. So now, yeah, sorry, one more. So, and as we're doing this transition, those of you on the sides, there are some seats. You can actually sit if you'd like. So we want to now move on to our second keynote. So we are extremely excited to have Tara Lyons here. She will now be getting mic'd up a second time, I hope. And so she is the founding executive director of the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. And artificial intelligence is one of the priority areas for the Hub. We'd love to see more work in this space. And so we're excited to have her tell you a little bit about that work. In the interim, I'll let you know that all of our projects are now officially online at aspentechpolicyhub.org. So the team that just presented has an awesome white paper and a bunch of infographics that will enable you to actually walk through the work. We've also already, Steve's website is already up and running, so there's lots of cool opportunities for you to actually engage with the stuff they're producing. And so please help us get the word out. So hopefully in just a second, Tara will be ready. Awesome. And the mic is there. So Tara, thank you so much for being here, and take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Betsy, and congratulations to the entire class of Tech Policy Fellows who are, I don't know if graduation is the right word for this occasion, but it's welcome to the dance, as Nicole put it. So in light of that, I was asked to kind of speak about the importance of AI to technology policy as a sort of set of questions and challenges in the moment in which we exist right now, and then also to sort of talk more generally about the importance of technology policy as work. So I thought I'd start with the latter and kind of ground part of this discussion in personal experience, especially given that some folks in the room may feel like you are newer to the field of tech policy. So if that's true of you, then think of this as sort of a personal account directed towards you. So what I'm about to share may seem to sort of run counter to the very popular and very rightfully so narrative that has sort of caught fire in the tech field, especially in the tech industry, that you need to really diminish the amount of hubris you approach the work with. And that's something Nicole referenced that I think is really important. I'll get back to that in a minute. So for a second, we're going to engage in a confidence building exercise. And it's not in conflict with that value. And I just want to state that. So I think the one kind of takeaway I want you to leave this room with is that you are all experts in one form or another in this field. And I want everyone to just sit with that for a moment and breathe it in, if that's how you think about things. And the reason why I think that's important is because I work for an organization called the Partnership on AI, as Betsy mentioned, and we were started by some of the leading researchers in the AI and machine intelligence field, and also a group of public interest advocates, all of whom are really interested in ensuring that the outcomes driven by AI technologies are for the benefit and not the detriment of humanity and the full inclusion of everybody. And I respect the hell out of the founders of our organization and the network of incredible experts that we work with every day, some of whom are people that have like multiple PhDs and whom are toiling in their specific corner of this ecosystem to make the world a better place. The funny thing about it, though, is that none of us, and I really mean that when I say it, have ever quite really done this before. And I think that speaks to the humility point that Nicole mentioned. Surely, I think some of us have done versions of it. So there are tech policy veterans, for example, who helped shape early internet governance or who've considered privacy issues since the dawn of privacy as a value. There are technology experts who literally built the internet, especially here in Silicon Valley in our midst, and people who helped build modern platform companies that are critical to everything that we do every single day as technologists, and people who just exist on the internet. But the particular challenges presented by the movement in which we find ourselves right now, sort of at the intersection of social justice and rights, government service delivery, and citizen trust in public institutions, technology development, and much, much more, calls for a renewed generation of advocates, policy experts, and advisors really looking to tackle problems for this new era. And we talk a lot internally at the partnership about what expertise really entails. We work with a lot of people who have PhDs, like I said before, and some who have no degrees at all, who are experts of a different form. And I think the takeaway for me from that experience has been that the technology policy road is very long and full of imposter syndrome, which I just want to name and talk about because I don't think we do that enough. And this field is both about having done your homework, which I'll talk much more about in a couple minutes, and indeed sometimes that requires expertise in the traditional form, but also it's deeply about practice. And I mean that in several ways. Practice insofar as meaning of the word that's related to practitioner, applying knowledge in real world in situ and delivering real outcomes by that. And also in the sense of like soccer practice, to be honest, or practicing the piano, because there's nothing quite like actually doing the damn thing to make you the expert that I'm talking about. And we need much more of those types of people. So I think the message here is roll up your sleeves, and we're so lucky to have you because honestly, the bench is not long enough. And there's a lot of work to be done. So I want to talk a little bit more about that work. And I think I'll start by talking about the importance of context. So now that we're done with the confidence building part of this discussion, I think I'll bring back the humility point because that's been another real learning for me in the context of the work that the partnership does every day and the context of the work that I did previously in government, where technology really does not exist as an abstract concept. And it's so important for the work that all of you are thinking about, that we are thinking about the partnership and otherwise, to make sure that we're really situating our analyses in ideas of power constructions, in ideas and the realities of current dynamics related to equity or inequity, and really framing the work that we do as technologists through a lens of the impact that our work has on real people every single day. And there's a quote that I actually don't have in front of me right now, so I won't be able to perfectly describe it, but we talk a lot about words that Brian Stevenson, some of you may be familiar with him as the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, write about in his biography, Just Mercy. And he talks a lot in that book about the importance of proximity to problem setting. And one of the dynamics that he described, or lessons that he learned growing up, was provided to him by his relationship with his grandmother, who told him words that ring true in our work as an AI governance institution every single day, which are essentially that you gotta get close to the problems that you're trying to solve in order to effectively understand them. And I think that, he certainly wasn't writing about it in the context of technology policy, but I don't think those words could be truer to almost any other context than the ones in which we operate, just because of the incredible amount of power that we have to affect positive or negative outcomes for real populations. So we do a lot of work in thinking critically about how we can effectively reach impacted and affected communities, traditionally marginalized populations. And those, I think, for us, we really try to make more than just buzzwords. We're really working with real people who need to be a necessary part of the process. So many more lessons to describe around that set of work for another time, maybe for the happy hour. And then I think another lesson that I want to be a takeaway is just that these challenges are so urgent and so important. And you know, sometimes I talk at the partnership about how a multi-stakeholder effort like PAI would not have been possible 5 years ago and may not be possible 5 years from now. And for those of you who are lacking context here or background on our organization, we were founded by Apple, Amazon, Facebook, IBM, Microsoft, and Google, and the ACLU, MacArthur Foundation, organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and many other civil society and advocacy organizations. We're a coalition of 100 institutions globally today. And these are not organizations that traditionally really get along. I mean, even within the same sector, to be honest, there's a lot of tension and complexity in the relationships there. And I have just been so profoundly impressed and privileged to witness the coming together of what can really truly be called a, you know, we're not fully representative. There's a lot of work to be done there still, like I said before, but a lot of very diverse organizations representing very diverse institutional interests in the urgency of the challenge set that we have in front of us right now. And I think that, you know, our existence is one proxy for the importance of this challenge, but there is so much activity happening across this space, and that's really because of the demand, honestly. There's just a huge demand for the type of expertise that I talked about previously that all of you hold, to be thinking about and considering some of these issues, whether in questions raised tonight, even in the presentation previously, or otherwise. So, you know, the fact that competitors have become collaborators under these conditions and advocates are working hand in hand with powerful commercial entities to impact direct behavior change of practitioners and the federal government at all levels here in the United States, you know, seems to start to be thinking about some of this stuff, which is also true of other countries as well, really speaks to the uniqueness of the moment that we're in, I think. And I think lastly, these challenges are really ubiquitous. So beyond just the fact that they're urgent and important, I think they're also everywhere. And when I formerly worked in government, I helped run a 40-agency steering committee that was really on these questions of AI governance, essentially. And we had a really hard time actually convincing agencies to come to the table who weren't science and technology policy mission-oriented agencies. So a lot of the sort of usual suspects like the National Science Foundation, Department of Transportation, you know, and otherwise were answering our calls, but a lot of, even the Department of Labor, honestly, and some other departments and institutions that really had equities in these debates didn't really have sufficient capacity to encounter the problems. And so, you know, that was, I will caveat this by saying that was before AI was as sexy as it is today. And it wasn't really understood as it is right now in the public narrative to be of this sort of urgency, you know, urgency and importance that I talked about previously. But it still remains true that there is a dire need for more people thinking about this from more directions, just because of the ubiquity. And I'm speaking specifically from the perspective of government, but this is true across the board in other sectors right now as well, including in the social sector. So that, I think, is just another piece of evidence meant to convince you to, if you're thinking about a challenge set to apply your expertise to, I think this is a really, really good one. So I think I'm going to end it there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great.
I can take, but yeah. Okay. Oh, I see. Thanks so much for your awesome conversation. I really love the work that you're doing in partnerships on AI. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, you know, this concept of ethics washing. I think that's something that a lot of people are concerned about with large tech companies who are making most of their revenue out of personalized advertisements, such as Facebook and Google. And I'd love to hear a bit more about what you're doing around certification, auditing, making sure that these tech companies are actually doing good things around their data practices, versus, you know, potential, are they just is this just talk, or are they actually walking the walk around initiating privacy by design, data protection by design? What kinds of auditing and certification are we doing of these tech companies who are involved?
Yeah, great question. So I think if I could extrapolate from your question for a brief moment, I think a lot of what you're getting at is this question of accountability, ultimately. And it's been a real question for our organization as well. I mean, we were not designed as a compliance organization, so PAI really exists situated sort of squarely between practice and policy, I think, as a sort of sandbox for experimentation in governance designs and policy mechanisms, especially for corporate institutions who really need to examine carefully what they're doing as commercial entities to develop products and promulgate this technology through development and deployment, right? So we have a couple of governance mechanisms that make us an independent organization. So we often talk about how we are not here to allow companies to buy an ethics policy, for example, and we make independent determinations as an entity. So although we have a coalition that we work really closely with on the design of multi-stakeholder work processes and research, that work is pretty carefully air-gapped from being influenced by the board, for example, including the founding institutions directly, and is essentially an outcome driven by an independent research organization which exists on our staff. So we are going to apply that power of independence in whatever way we can to speak truth to power where that's an appropriate option. And we've actually only been operational for a year, so we have still an emergent body of work. Actually, our earliest policy work was on risk assessment tools and their use in the criminal justice system, inspired by the SB 10 emergence late last year, and the provision that all counties in the state use algorithmic risk assessment tools in replacement of the money bail system, essentially. So we're working with policy entities and commercial organizations, tool funders, et cetera, about reforming practice in that realm. We also have a work set on transparency in the machine learning development pipeline. So you spoke a lot to privacy considerations and values, and that's not really an area of work that we have yet really touched, but it's possible we'll go there. And if and when we do, then we'll be making independent determinations to which we hope we can hold some of our commercial entities accountable ultimately in their practice.
One more question.
This is also geared to your work at the partnership. How much are you looking at international relations, especially China is a big topic in AI?
Yeah, another great question. So we are a global organization, at least in name. We are not fully representative, so with that caveat, we do have Baidu involved, as well as several NGOs in the APAC region, and a lot of organizations in Europe and North America. And we have a lot of work to do still to really figure out how to best and most effectively support effective conversations and effective tech policy deliberations, basically, in those areas that we don't have direct representation in, and also those areas that we do. And China is a really big question mark there, I think. We have, like I said, a ton of competing values in our institution, but we have overarching values, for example, centered on human rights convention as a guiding principle. So it's been really interesting to kind of watch the dialogues play out internally within our community with the stakeholders that we have involved. And I think this is my personal perspective and not an institutional one, but I am relatively hopeful, made more hopeful by a dynamic that I've seen unfold or have learned about, which is a perception that I have around the fact that there's a lot of interest in sort of scientist to scientist dialogue and collaboration, especially between China and other parts of the world. And there's a really, there's a thriving sort of hungry research ecosystem there full of people who, like many people here in the Valley even, are working within commercial institutions and questioning some of the work that they're doing and the impact that it's going to have on society. And so to the extent that we can help sort of guide practice behaviors and shape norms, I think we're really interested in doing that, and doing that for all the organizations with which we work.
Awesome. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Tara. We have a little hub parting gift for you. Hang on.
Sorry.
little gift for you. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate your inspirational words. And so now we're going to turn back to the fellows. So you might notice that Neil Park is not, unfortunately, standing up here. He missed his flight coming from New York and so is unable to join us. Luckily for him, his partner, Ginny, happens to be presenting later on her own project, and she generously volunteered to take it over and to present Neil's as well. So we're going to turn it over to Ginny, part one, for her project. So.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am not Neil Park, but Neil is one of my collaborators, as is Brandy Noneke, on this project related to test-driven development for technology policy. There was a great question earlier that was about how do we have more trust in the policymaking process? And Nicole's answer to that question was transparency. We need more transparency in these systems. And our project addresses that. Many of the projects you'll see from the Hub today are about how do we change policy, and our project's about how do we change the process of creating technology policy. So the goal of our proposal is to help make technology policy more robust. And what we mean by robustness is that technology policy would ensure that the policy actually addresses the problem of interest and that it avoids unintended consequences. The way we propose we will do this is by applying principles that are used to develop great software. So why would one apply the principles of building software towards the process of building policy? And we actually think that code and policy have a lot in common, and so actually there's an analogy here that we could convert into some process actions. So code and policy are pretty similar because, one, they both introduce new rules within an existing complex system. Two, they are both built to handle a range of possible conditions, and these conditions can be really hard to anticipate. And finally, both code and policy need to work every single time. Software has had moments of needing, as an industry, to reform its processes to make software more reliable. And actually, in 1968, NATO convened a conference because there was a software crisis. The crisis came because computing systems were developing really, really fast, and computing power had gone off the charts, and software engineers were having a field day of coding and coding and coding, and things were just breaking. The code was spaghetti. It was really hard to have software that was reliable in any way, and a bunch of systems were going down. And so NATO convened a group to say, as an industry, we need to come up with better processes to make our products more reliable. And it was out of that testing frameworks and a process called test-driven development became a backbone of how software is and continues to be built. And so test-driven development relies on testing every line of code you write. What is a software test? Here's an example of what it would look like to test a phone number. So imagine you're a software engineer, you're building a form in which people would need to insert their phone number. And we would want to take a lot of different kinds of phone numbers, right? We would want, for the first two examples, we would want both of those formats to be processed, but we wouldn't want an invalid format processed. We wouldn't want a UK number to be submitted if it's a service for US citizens only. We wouldn't want letters to be submitted for a phone number, for example. And so as an engineer, as you were writing code for this, you would actually first come up with all the examples. You would say, okay, these are examples of phone numbers we would want to work, and these are examples of phone numbers or non-phone numbers that we don't want to work. And you would write tests. This format works, this format shouldn't work. Then you would write the code. And you would write a little program about taking in the phone number, and then finally you would run the test and you would confirm that the program you wrote satisfies the conditions and specifications you laid out first. So here's a little graphic of just how that process works. But what could it mean for policy? We're proposing that you could write policy tests. And these tests would not be code, they would be words, they would be text, and they would be examples of concrete situations that policy is or is not supposed to address. instead of code, what you would be writing in response to the test would be actually policy language, drafts of new policy. And then running the tests, which for software engineers is done completely by the computer. Running the tests in our case would be actually a process of sitting down and using your concrete example and using the policy you wrote and seeing if the result from the concrete example actually matched what you intended when you ran it through the policy you had drafted. So we're going to walk through an example, a case study of how this might work concretely. And that is a new act called the Detour Act, which Senator Warner and Senator Fisher jointly introduced. And this act is about dark patterns. A dark pattern is a manipulative online marketing practice. And this act is about how do we make illegal online marketing practices that are created to deceive users. So for example, this bill might want to make illegal this concrete example, which is you would agree to the terms and conditions without actually seeing them. Or like it's kind of hard to click in and see them. Or my favorite example of what would be illegal is putting a fake hair on an ad so that people tried to swipe the hair off of the screen of their phone and then they click into the ad. I know, I wish I was in the meeting where this idea was come up with, because some companies actually do this. But we want to make this illegal, for example. But what we would like to still be legal is this perfectly normal, everyday ad for the New York Times cooking section. So how do we design tests? Designing tests is a creative process. There's no formula, there's no set way that you can necessarily just have the test spit out. And it's a creative process that will require a lot of brainstorming and collaboration, but we believe that there are patterns of the types of tests one could write to ensure strong technology policy. And we've created a long table, much longer than this, of what we call categories of tests. The questions you would ask to arrive at that category of test. And then finally, examples to make a little bit more concrete what we're proposing. So for example, in the subcategory, the second one on the list, the subcategory test, let's pretend that we're writing a content moderation policy. And in that policy, we would like nudity to be illegal. So you can't post nude photos on Facebook, for example. So tests that we might create to see if our policy is functioning as expected is we might have an example of a clip of pornography and an example of a nude in art. And we would want the nude in art to pass and be allowed, and we would want the pornography to fail and not be allowed. So these are some of the types of tests that would come out of this. And then the benefits of this process, we believe, and of the continually iterating over examples, are ensuring that policymakers consider a range of examples in advance. That writing tests is actually a lot easier than writing policy. You don't need to be a lawyer to write tests, so it's a way to engage industry experts as well as the public. And then finally, tests can be used flexibly, and you could only test certain parts of the code of the policy that are particularly murky, or you could use tests to ensure the thoroughness of your entire policy. But this philosophy can be used in part to make stronger policy. It doesn't need to be a huge effort or a complete redo of the way policy is made. So that's it for us. Thank you.
Questions for Jamie?
Thank you. I'm a software engineer. I use test-driven development every day. I tend to use it to build my code. I write my test first, run it, and then I continually run the test over and over. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of analog, how do you run the tests?
Yeah, it's a great question. Also, I applaud you for being the type of engineer who writes tests first, because throughout my software engineering career, I have never done that, though it is what you're supposed to do. Often people will write code first and then they'll write the test. So anyway, you're much more of a purist than I. To your question around how do you actually run them, the way we imagine this happening in the policy context is having meetings where all of the collaborators on the policy come up with, read the test and say, for example, nudes and artwork, we would want to allow that, and read through all of the specifications of the policy and just manually imagine, based on what we have on this page, would it be true that nudes and art would be allowed but pornography would be banned, for example. So it's less rigorous than software testing, in which a computer will definitively tell you yes or no for sure. But still, we believe the process of coming up with examples and considering those examples alongside a final draft of an actual policy document would be an improvement and a way to utilize concrete situations in the policy that's created. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering, how would the Thank you. Hi. How would the process deal with ambiguity? So a lot of policy ends up getting tested or interpreted in the courts. So you might have a range of different outcomes rather than this is legal or this is illegal or whatever under the policy that's being tested.
No, it's a great question. I believe that for some of the more ambiguous parts of policies, often still have language. So for example, one of the other fellows, Aloni Cohen, had his whole project about the term probabilistic identifier and making sure there was more thoroughness around what a probabilistic identifier was in the California Consumer Privacy Act. So what we're imagining is you could write tests that help define in a more specific fashion what a term like that's a fairly broad term that could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. That what a term like that would mean, and publish in advance, these are examples of what this would cover, these are examples of what it would not cover. And so when the policy is made live, those ambiguous sections, though still clearly there will be ambiguity, there are at least a few concrete examples specifying how it was meant to be interpreted.
Awesome. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Ginny, part one. And I'll need to borrow the clicker back wherever. Oh, thank you. Awesome. So next, I want to introduce Brandy Noneke. She runs the Citrus Policy Lab at UC Berkeley, and she's going to be talking to you about the Public Interest Research Alliance. So.
Thank you. I remember being here in June, was it? And it's really great to see all of the progress that's been made by the fellows, and that I have almost doubled in size. And then also just heads up, I will probably get out of breath because there's not a lot of room in my chest for my lungs to work anymore. But bear with me. So each day, billions of people use social media platforms to document the best parts of their lives, their greatest joys, their best memories, their greatest achievements. At the same time, however, these platforms also document the worst parts of humanity. They document human rights atrocities, hate crimes, hate speech, harassment. The ability to pull data from platforms for research and investigations is critical. Platforms are now the holder of the world's histories. In this video, you'll see Cameroonian soldiers leading 2 women away at gunpoint. Later in the video, they're forced to the ground and they are shot 22 times for being suspected members of Boko Haram. The Cameroonian government claimed that the video had been faked, and so reporters, human rights investigators, and researchers worked together to corroborate the video. You might have seen a red line being drawn in the background. They were looking at a distinctive ridge line, a mountain ridge line, and they were able to tie that to a Google image to show exactly where the atrocity had occurred. So the ability for those researchers, investigators, and journalists to be able to gain access to these videos and then verify through open source investigations allows for the accountability and transparency of these types of atrocities. As I said, the Cameroonian government claimed it was fake news. This is a phrase we hear very common here in the United States, and it's highly problematic that if we don't allow people to be able to gain access to data from platforms, people can run wild with just saying it's fake news, right? If there's no definitive truth, then everything is a lie. And so the ability for researchers to be able to access this data for public interest research is critical. So I want to give a couple of examples of the pushback from platforms. So this platform called StockScan uses Facebook's Graph API, which allows you to query public data in an efficient way from Facebook. It's very horribly named, I think, StockScan, but whatever, it is what it is, and that's actually kind of what it does. you can look up other people's information on their public profiles. So in June, Facebook restricted the ability to be able to query that data in such a way that it made the platform essentially unusable by any of these human rights investigators, researchers, or journalists. And still to this day, it's very limited in its capacity. So right now we're obviously seeing a lot of pushback on platforms to become better policers of what's being distributed on their platforms. You can see all of us in this room know that these platforms are being used to spread terrorist content, recruitment strategies, harassment, human rights abuses, hate speech. We're also seeing this being met by increased regulation. So we have the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act, but we have this tension emerging, right? You want to mitigate the spread of nefarious content that causes ill to society, but you also want to be able to document those atrocities. Because if we don't, then we won't have a record of what's happened. I sort of think of the role of platforms right now as kind of like the Library of Alexandria. It's just burning before our eyes, and if we don't intervene, we're going to lose some of our histories. There's another tension, of course, around privacy and security. How do we ensure that data that people provide for platforms is private and secure, but then also is made available to ensure this critical public interest research? But there are people who have made great strides in this space. So Social Science One, which is a collaboration between Stanford and Harvard and Facebook to try to gain access to some of the public data and other data sets for public interest research. The Internet Observatory at Stanford, the Human Rights Center, they do a lot of work on open source investigations, and the SMAP lab at NYU. But this work has been met with great difficulty in being actually implemented in practice. As I said before, the introduction of regulation like the EU GDPR and the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, has led to these regulatory unknowns, especially around, well, what does data anonymity mean? How do we ensure that data is private and secure? And because of that, we're seeing platforms like Facebook, which had a collaboration with these academic institutions to share data, have decided we're not going to share the data until we can confirm how we can share that data in a way that upholds privacy and security, which is a lofty goal, and I commend them on that. But we need to be cautious that they don't just sit there and no longer share data in the future. So during the fellowship, I did interviews with quite a few platforms like Facebook, Reddit, Google, YouTube, and also with academic institutions like Social Science One, which I had mentioned. And overwhelmingly from those interviews, it became apparent that we need rules of the road. We need some guideposts on what does it mean to interpret these nascent data privacy regulations in the context of research, especially public interest research. So I had this idea, let's start something called the Public Interest Research Alliance, which would be a multi-stakeholder, non-binding coalition of the different stakeholder groups who need to be at the table when discussing these issues. So including academics, industry representatives, governmental, intergovernmental, and non-governmental organizations. And our goal really is to guide the appropriate collection, storage, and sharing of data from platforms for public interest research. And so I got started on developing some principles. We have 4 draft principles around the rules of the road. So around multi-stakeholder collaboration, how do we ensure that each stakeholder group has equal participation and influence in this group in setting these standards and guideposts? Around governance, accountability, and transparency within the operation of the organization itself. Setting guideposts on the responsibility of research. So obviously everybody in this room's heard of Cambridge Analytica. A lot of what they had done first was a research endeavor. How do we ensure that when we're giving data out from these platforms that it's supporting research that has a maximizing benefit for society and is not used to actually exploit individuals? And then the last round, privacy, security, and integrity. So what new governance and technical strategies must we implement to better ensure that data is not just held internally within the platforms, but that we develop these strategies that allow them to share the data in a way that is private, secure, and upholds integrity. So the citruspolicylab.org, where I work, I've hosted the PIRA principles and operational guides, the draft, and it's just citruspolicylab.org/PIRA. It's also on the handout out in the reception area. So I'll open it up now for questions. In the back.
Thank you. I'm Danny O'Brien. I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I mean, we've seen the similar kind of pattern of the dangers or the challenges of matching mitigation with documentation. I guess one of the questions I have about anything in this space is that I think it's a challenge to work out how to do it within the sort of credentialed academic community. But it's even harder now we have an environment where many of the people practicing open source research and investigations are outside of academia and perhaps even also outside traditional journalism. Maybe you could speak a little about like how you feel that you might be able to create rules of the road that can also apply to people who might be off-road a bit more.
Yeah, and we have encouraged in the responsibility principle, we have an operational guide on actually going through an institutional review board process, which is typically an academic endeavor, but there are also independent institutional review boards that can review the research and practices of these entities as an accountability mechanism. This is mostly applied to data that a person would have to get from the platform, so it's probably not public data, but data that maybe was once public but violated terms and conditions, so now it's considered private data and they want access to it, so there's this higher bar now of accessing the data. But the ability for individuals to just pull data from the API and do their own research, it's sort of outside of the realm of this.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious, like how are you able through this kind of alliance to ensure that there's a sense of balance between the commercial interests of the platforms that hold the data and the people who are looking to get the data, especially because that data is no longer public?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're saying we could have researchers who try to get this data to then use it later for a commercial interest?
I mean, yeah, or the fact that companies like to keep their data close to the vest because there's commercial use for it.
Yeah, of course, it would be very hard to twist the arm of the company to get them to give up data that they don't want to, right? It's their data, they own it, unfortunately, right, in many ways. So that I think would be a difficult endeavor. But I do think that there's momentum from the platforms to open up a little bit more and give researchers access to that data. And I think that there's a business benefit to them because they're under increased scrutiny. And if they produce a report on what's happened in the 2020 presidential election on how their system was manipulated, that's a very questionable study. And I think that the companies are looking for more of these outsiders to come in and work with them to be able to evaluate their services and products. Otherwise, they risk, I think, greater scrutiny from regulators and potential firm regulation.
That's a great note on which to leave it. Thank you so much, Brandy. Next up, I'd like to introduce Aura Tanner. She is coming to us from the state of Florida. She's an educational technology researcher, and she's going to be talking about her work on data-driven school safety systems in Florida. Over to you, Aura.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Woo! Okay, I'm really excited to be here with you this evening to share with you my project on data-driven school safety initiatives. I bring you greetings from the Sunshine State of Florida, or as many of you know it, the cybersecurity capital of the world, and also the #1 destination where hackers go to retire. But I digress. This topic is very near and dear to my heart. Even though my background is in physics, where I worked in nuclear medicine, I did teach as an 8th grade science educator. So the way that data is used concerning K through 12 children is very important to me. So after the Parkland shootings in February of 2018, legislators across the country kind of reacted by going to technology as a solution for this social issue. And so they started passing all these different laws. In my home state of Florida, they took a really aggressive approach. And so my background, well, one of the things I do in my background is an instructional designer. So I created this video with just an overview of, just to give you an idea of what the topic is, the policy that was passed.
The Florida Schools Safety Portal, or FSSP. The Florida Schools Safety Portal is a database that was established as part of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Bill, signed into law in Florida in May 2019. The law included a provision that established a centralized integrated data repository with analytic resources. It is to be used as a tool by threat assessment teams at K-12 schools to identify students believed to be on the pathway to committing a mass shooting and intervening before they act. To date, there is no evidence-based research to back up a data-driven approach, such as the FSSP, in preventing mass gun violence in schools. So why should you care about the Florida Schools Safety Portal? Well, for one, the FSSP uses a lot of data to make decisions about students. What data, you ask? Oh, just a few sensitive data points from various sources, including but not limited to the Florida Department of Children and Families, Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, local law enforcement, Baker Act admissions, social media monitoring data, school environmental safety incident reporting system that collects data on 26 incidents of crime, violence, and disruptive behaviors, and information from Fortify Florida, an application that shows suspicious activity that has been reported. So, what's the big deal? If the FSSP stops the next school shooter, we should use it, right? Well, just how safe will students be if their personal information is at risk? Guardrails for data governance, student privacy, security, and protections against bias within the FSSP system must be put in place. Without these, malicious actors could access the personally identifiable information of over 2.8 million students in Florida's public schools. The FSSP would harm more students than it would help. Remember, keeping students' data safe is a part of school safety. As a community, Florida must hold policymakers accountable for being transparent about how they will ensure both the physical and online safety of students attending the state's public schools.
So that's just an overview. So to recap, there's a huge database that actually is a law. It was passed in May 2019. This database portal went to effect on August 1st, just before we started our school year. And so I have attended some of the School Safety Commission meetings, and since...
Let's make a change. I like to change the fact that I don't know public parks in Los Angeles have artificial.
My DJ for my slide presentation. So some things that have changed since then is that they're no longer referring to it as a centralized integrated database because they realize the limitations that there are on building such a thing and bringing all of the data into one place. And they have concluded that there's nothing new that's been added by trying to bring all of this together. Plus there were the hurdles of data privacy and security that they had to overcome. So as was mentioned, this is a lot of students across a lot of districts, but what I'm more concerned about is that 55.8% of the students in Florida are African American and Latinx, and it's their data that are in these data sets, so they're the ones that will be disproportionately impacted by this policy. And this is just kind of how it works. Basically, in a nutshell, a student is flagged for some type of behavior that a teacher or someone else deems as could possibly be a threat. And what they envisioned was that these authorized users would go to this database, put in the student's name or birthday or student number, and pull up all this data magically across the student. The threat assessment teams looks at it based, I don't know if it's some rubric, there's been a lack of transparency around that, and they determine how they will intervene with this student or to what degree they believe they are a threat to school safety. So there's several issues. One, it's not evidence-based. There's no research to support using students' administrative data for surveillance and monitoring purposes. Also, there was no community input, so you need to have representation from the communities whose data is being used and who's going to be impacted. The thing I'm interested in, there needs to be a plan how to mitigate bias. So a lot of these data sets, such as Department of Juvenile Justice, Department of Children and Families, are highly correlated with race and socioeconomic status. So there has to be something to mitigate that bias, as well as observation bias from those on the threat assessment teams looking at it. So this is what I decided to do about this policy. These are some of my outputs that I have done. So I'm just going to jump right in. One of the first things I did was messaging. So I wanted to get publicity about it. I wanted to get education out about it. And I also wanted to build relationships. So I wrote an op-ed in the Tampa Bay Times to talk about the social and technological implications of this policy. I was interviewed for the Washington Tech Policy podcast, where I talked about race and this database that they're looking at doing. Have a peer-reviewed policy brief coming out in a journal along with my fellow cohort homie person, Carissa. There was an episode on NPR On Point out of Boston where they had an episode on student surveillance and wrote an article for CNBC and WSF, which is in Florida. And just last week, I had a student highlight at my university where I'm working on my doctoral degree, University of South Florida, where they also highlighted it. And that's just the op-ed. I also gave a public comment at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Public Safety Commission, where I was able to ask them to consider recommendations around accountability, transparency, and fairness in an operational plan. And so they have that, and we're kind of going back and forth on that right now. And that's me. And with my background in instructional design, I've made one-pagers that will be given out to parents and students. And you saw the video explainer. I met with a university class of special education teachers to talk about the implications for special education students. So my next steps are I'm going to shoot for the stars. I'm going to be working with an educational advocacy group. So to use all of these things that are now in a toolkit to get some actions by parents, students, and educators to bring about more transparency. Next week, I will actually be going to get some student insights because we need their voices as a part of this policy-making process. And then I'm just going to keep pushing for transparency about mitigating the bias on this law. So I'm just looking for as many things as I can do to make sure that the individuals who will be most impacted have a voice in this policy. So if there's any questions.
Hi, my name is Josephine. It's curious because something very similar is happening in France and just got very viral. And it just shut down the program because they made transparent what were the criteria to where they could detect someone. So I'm curious. That's when they just showed up how discriminatory they were and how biased they were. That everybody shut down was like, this is completely ridiculous. So at what point do they say this student is a problem? What are the signals? What are the criteria?
Well, that's what I'm trying to push for them to reveal because literally on this law, there's really been little shared with the public. So outside of just knowing the databases that they're using, so obviously someone made a decision. I don't know why they have that power to decide they were using those data points, but they're actually looking at adding even more data sets, even though it's not even fully up and operational. At the last commission meeting, they were looking at using even more data points. But the commission itself is mainly composed of all law enforcement and lawyers, and it's pretty much all white males, so they've been criticized for that. So I'm pushing for them to make public what is your rubric, what are the decision-making models, what are the criteria. So that's what I'm trying to get to, actually.
Awesome. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Aura. And now, do you have the clicker? Thank you. So now, last but not least, I'd like to formally introduce Ginny as herself this time. Ginny is a software engineer. She most recently was working at Uber. She's also been doing some amazing work working with venture capital in light of the Me Too movement. So she's been extremely involved in that front. And so she's doing lots of amazing work focused on older users and government design. And she's going to wrap us up by telling us a little bit about that. So thank you so much, Ginny.
Thank you. Yes, excited to be talking about older users and government design. And in particular, something we don't always think about is how the internet affects each of us differently. And the internet enables so many great things, right? It enables the ability to communicate, to buy things, to see the world through images and maps, to fall in love, to be entertained. And yet the internet touches all of us differently, and it touches us differently based on the profile we bring, the education we have, the friends we have. And in the case of older adults, it touches them differently in one way that's particularly challenging, which is they are targeted for online scams and scams over the phone at much higher rates than any other segment of the population. And those scams and hacks that are targeted at older adults who are perceived to maybe not know better or to be an easy get or whatever for crimes. When you look online, the problem's getting a lot worse online, and actually in the past 5 years of online scams, they've increased for older adults by over 400%. When an older adult gets scammed, the average amount lost is $42,000, which is the cost of a brand new BMW 3 Series. So that's a lot of money. Seniors could all be buying BMWs, and instead they're getting scammed. When you look at the scams that are happening online, it's actually alarming how many of them are happening on online dating platforms. So individuals impersonating somebody who wants to date an older adult, establish a relationship, a rapport over many months, and then say they're in hard straits and ask for money to be sent. And older adults will willingly send money and lose a lot doing it. And social media scams are fourth most popular through identity theft on social media or impersonating personalities on social media, and then using a new close relationship with an older adult to trick them into giving a lot of money. And so it's surprising to me how many scams are starting to be on online dating platforms. For the government to work on this problem, they need to have data around it. And in particular, the FBI and the FTC both have extensive scam data sets. But there's an estimate that only 1 in 30 scams that happens ever ends up in a government database in any sort. And so the goal of our policy project was, how can we improve online scam reporting for seniors, as they're the population that is getting scammed online the most? Tara made a comment earlier about the importance of getting close to problems, the Brian Stevenson quote she brought up. And in tech speak, the way tech companies talk about getting close to problems is they say, let's do user-centered design. And user-centered design means when you're trying to solve a problem, get really close with people who are having the problem and interview them and understand with specificity what exactly the issue is, and then work with them to design a solution. And so that's what we did. We, talking to government agencies, social workers, folks working on this problem across the legal profession, older citizens' homes, the government, we saw very few older adults actually being involved in conversations about how to solve the problem. So we conducted a design thinking workshop here in San Francisco with 3 local senior centers. And the theme of the workshop was, how can the internet be better for you? So we had people tell us a lot about great times they'd had online, awesome experiences, cool things that had happened to them because the internet existed. And then we asked them to brainstorm times when they felt most unsafe online and times when they felt most frustrated online. And we captured all of that, and then we asked them to test the reporting form for reporting a potential scam to the FBI. And what we learned is that people who are high intent to report scams to the government and who are on this website and have decided they're going to tell a government official about something terrible that happened to them where they lost a ton of money and were embarrassed and humiliated, they get to this website, and for a number of seemingly subtle design reasons, they actually cannot fill out this form. The older adult I was user testing with spent over a minute trying to click in to this grayed out section. And many of us who have spent our careers working on technology products intuitively know the design language of grayed out means don't click it. But he clicked for over a minute and then got so frustrated he stood up and left and said, I hate this exercise, I don't want to do this. And these are the people who are closest to telling the government about what's happened to them and closest to enabling possible prevention using the data from the scam. So we've created a list of design recommendations for government agencies, and we've circulated this list with the relevant group at the FBI as well as with the FTC and a number of other agencies. We've also built a new reporting form, and this new reporting form utilizes the US Web Design Standards, and it is a reporting form that we believe will enable more older adults to fill out and submit information to the government. We've tested it with older adults in the same workshop, and they seem to like it a lot better. And this form is actually going to be used by government agencies as they're revamping their scam reporting, and this will be what they start with when they come up with their new system. This is some of the groups we met with in DC. So the FBI is going to leverage the work we've done on this project, as is the FTC. And then the Cybercrime Support Network has a large grant from the Department of Homeland Security, and they're the group who's going to be taking our reporting form and helping it get to the next level. We're also really passionate about making sure that corporations who have data about scams start contributing that data to government. And so we have a policy brief where we outline exactly how we believe that should happen, and the FTC has been excited to hear these recommendations and start to put them in motion. And then finally, we've created a website. It's an online resource for older adults and their families who have suffered from scams about how to report it and what next steps should be. So that's the project. Thank you.
Questions for Jenny?
So, your research here focused a lot on the FBI. What about other agencies that might, also have jurisdiction over issues that affect seniors and that they might want to report to, at state level, other federal agencies? Were there problems there too that you found, or is there any indication of how they might improve?
The reason why we published, or why we tested the FBI form in particular, was that they're the group that's published the most data about the problem. And so we started with their form because we only had a certain amount of time with seniors. We had to narrow down. The FTC also has reporting forms, and those reporting forms in some ways are better and in some ways share some of the same obstacles that are present in the FBI form, but we presented the design recommendations across agencies that deal with this problem and not just to the FBI.
Thank you for this. I love taking the user-centered design approach. One thing that I've done with user-centered design is figuring out a channel strategy. Did you do any research to distinguish if that form itself was the best channel for this audience, or if like a phone number would have been more appropriate or something like that?
There's currently no phone number, which is a huge obstacle. And we believe that a phone number would dramatically increase the reports coming in. There's actually an effort at way right now to create a phone number, but because alternatives to reporting online didn't exist, we just chose the online alternative that was publishing the most data, that had a team committed to this issue, and that also seemed to be the way that most people were finding where to report to government.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ginny, and thank you to everybody who has presented today. So I just want to take a few minutes to ask you, go online, check everything out. Some of the fellows have produced infographics, they've produced toolkits, they've produced white papers. There's amazing things, so go see what they've actually built. Also, if you're interested in doing this work, consider applying to our program. We'll open up for our next cohort, which will be summer 2020. Those applications should open up in early December. And we actually also have a January cohort, and there are a few people in the audience who might or might not be a part of that. So we look forward to introducing you to them in January. I want to give a special thanks to Northwestern University, to Lawrence and JP for hosting us. Thank you guys so much for allowing us to be a part. I'd like to thank Nicole and Tara for inspiring our fellows and for being a part of it today. I'd like to thank David and Ryan for helping to set up this amazing event, as well as all the vendors that are helping us. And finally, I want to thank the fellows. So these guys took a chance on a program that didn't exist when they decided to apply, and really have done some amazing things. And I hope you'll join me first in thanking them, and then coming and having a drink to celebrate them. So thank you so much for being here. It's been our pleasure. Thanks again.